So in this video, I want to talk about the Lumix BGH1 and basically why it's a worrying camera for Panasonic to be releasing in 2020. I feel like this is a camera that should have come out in 2018 alongside the GH5S. If it came out then, that would have been a perfectly acceptable camera. It would have kind of matched all the specs of the time. It would have been a pretty interesting niche camera, and I feel like it would have been a good camera to buy in 2018. So what I want to do is kind of go through Panasonic's website, look at the features of this camera, and kind of say where I feel like they've taken missteps and where it could have been a much better camera had they done a few things slightly differently. So if I take a look at the website, okay, let's go back to the top. So first thing they say is that this is a box style cinema and live camera. And yes, I can totally see this being a live camera, especially at the moment. Live is as important as it ever has been. Loads of companies doing high-end professional live content and multi-camera content as well. These cameras are designed to be used as multi-cam cameras. That's where something like this would come in really handy. You get amazing quality for kind of live production, and the camera's really kind of small and easy to control over Ethernet and stuff like that. I think that's a really good positive point for this camera, but they do start it off saying box style cinema. So that's what I'm judging on. That's what I would be looking at this camera. Not to say that I do cinema productions, it's just more cinematography and creative productions. That's why I feel like they put the cinema in there, is to appeal to those sort of buyers, which would potentially be myself and potentially be some of you guys watching. So what I want to talk about first of all is the really lackluster improvement over the GH5S. So the GH5S is a camera that I really love using. I bought it back in 2018. It's been a camera that I've really enjoyed every time I picked it up. And it was definitely the first camera that I started shooting with, and I felt like it could deliver the sort of images that I wanted a camera to deliver. And I think that was tied in with the really good vlog profile. I used it on a load of different kind of creative and commercial shoots, and for the most part, it held up really nicely. But 2 years later, I kind of know this camera inside out, and seeing as the BGH1 is just a GH5S kind of squeezed into a box, I feel like I know the BGH1 even though I haven't used it. So that's what I'm kind of basing a lot of this off, and I feel like that's a fair place to base it from. So the major issue for me is that the recording kind of compressions and codecs using the GH5S are really dated at this point. They use a .mov container and a .h.265 container, and both of those offer really kind of lackluster compression tied in with the bit rates that Panasonic are giving those containers. So for instance, the 1080p 50 frames per second in 10-bit is 200 megabytes per second. That's enough data to deliver a really nice looking image, but it does struggle when you get into mixed lighting, and it does struggle when you have lots of shadows in a shot. And I've noticed that consistently, no matter what kind of ISO you're at, if you're shooting at the cleanest possible with the lowest possible kind of signal to noise ratio, this camera always has issues with shadows. They should have upped pretty much in all the profiles. It would have been nice to see like a HQ plus option. So for the 1080p 50, up that to 400. For the 4K 25, up that to 800. We know that the cards are capable of doing that. That's 800 megabits per second. It's only 80 megabytes per second. And the major one they should have improved, seeing as they're expecting this to be used on drones. That's a big thing they're kind of pushing this. They want people to use it on drones. And I think people are going to be looking at this not only to mount kind of high quality optics to a drone, but also for its slow motion features. So you can get a full sensor readout in 1080p up to 200 frames per second. And the problem is that codec is 200 megabits per second, so that's 20 megabytes divided by 200 frames, and that is roughly 100 kilobits per frame. So really, really low quality slow motion recording. I've done a lot of slow motion shots with the GH5S. I know that we can get a shot that's pretty close, but I have to do a lot of post work to make those shots usable. Definitely denoise it, even though it's not really noise, it's more like artifacting, and then re-noise it, kind of make it look a bit more normal-ish. But that's a lot of work to go through just to get usable slow motion footage out of the GH5S. If Panasonic doubled or quadrupled the slow motion recording bit rate up to ideally 800 megabits per second, I feel like you'd get much more usable slow motion recording mode, especially for drone work. If you're doing slow motion on a drone, not only is the drone going fast, so you've got a lot of movement in that frame, which the H.265 compression is going to struggle with anyway, like limiting that to a really low bitrate codec just feels like a complete misstep in my mind. Another thing I'd like to talk about is the codecs they're using. So I've got the Pocket 4K here. This obviously uses B-RAW. And the thing about Blackmagic RAW is that Blackmagic RAW is pretty much open source. Blackmagic want other companies to implement Blackmagic RAW onto their cameras. It's not something that's limited to the Blackmagic ecosystem. They want it to be used by other companies. Panasonic could download that SDK. They could develop their own Blackmagic RAW kind of functionality in camera. And I don't know if that requires different processors or certain chips to kind of deal with that data. But even if it made this camera a tiny bit bigger and it offered Blackmagic RAW recordings, not only would the 60p recording that it does now be way higher than the 420 kind of chroma compression they put on it, you would actually get 444 12-bit images coming off the sensor. We know it's possible because the sensor is literally identical. So the sensor's using the GH5S, the BGH1, and also the Pocket 4K, if I get this light on there. You can see the sensor is literally identical. Same sensor, same, I don't know what it is, Sony IMX292 or 294. They're identical. So not only has like Panasonic could use Blackmagic RAW, but they know it works really well with the sensor they're using in that camera. So it feels like a massive misstep that they haven't included Blackmagic RAW or at least some sort of like P-RAW, like a Panasonic RAW, something that goes beyond these kind of H.265 and .mov containers, something that's really easy to work with in post, has the flexibility of RAW, so you can obviously change your white balance properly, change your ISO, all the kind of flexibility of RAW, but with the compression and post-production kind of handling of Blackmagic RAW. That felt like a massive misstep to me. And I was really hoping, I feel like that's something Panasonic should really be aware of, that they need to implement this technology that is literally there. Just that they have people in-house that I'm sure could develop Blackmagic RAW for their system. It feels like a complete misstep that they haven't included it. One of the good things I can see is that they've updated Vlog. So on this camera, you get the updated version of Vlog. So instead of having that 81 IRE kind of like hard cap, you have, I think it must go up to 100 IRE now, which gives you an extra stop of latitude in your highlights, which is really nice to see. It's not like it was ever a major issue in any production. I'm trying to think of something there where it caused an issue having that highlight gap. Not really, but it is always nice to feel like the highlights are going to roll off a bit softer with the new Vlog L profile. And this is just software, so I'm surprised at the same time they didn't offer an update for the GH5S to have this new Vlog L profile. Hopefully they'll do something like that to GH5S, but I kind of doubt it. The other good thing is, obviously you do get external recording, so if you want slightly higher recording, like the GH5S, you get external recording via the HDMI, and you can get 422, 10-bit, up to 60 frames per second in Cinema 4K, and that would be really good, and I can see that being useful on GH5S. But on this camera, obviously there's no status display. Like if you take a look at this camera, you have an LCD on the back, which obviously this camera doesn't have, but on the top you have a status display. So at least you know what kind of ISO you're in, what shutter speed you're at, your aperture, stuff like that. This doesn't have a status display, so if you are recording at the HDMI to a recorder, you obviously have to have a clean feed. So that can't have any information on it. So when you're doing that, you can't see your shutter speed, your ISO, aperture. You'd have to view that through the app. And let's go on to here. So on some of the promo material, they had someone shooting like this. So if you did want to record higher quality in a hand, like running gun setup, handheld setup similar to this one here, you would have to control the camera via the app. And that feels like such a step backwards when cameras like the Z-Cam that they've based this design off, offer a little status display on the top. It feels like it's the easiest thing in the world to add that to this camera and would add so much more functionality, make it way more flexible. They haven't done that. I like the custom function buttons, but again, if you've got no status display, say if I was mapping that one to 4K 25 and 1080p 200, I'd want to know when I switch between them, I'd want to have some sort of update on the status display, even if it's only just a glance at. So there's so many times in a shoot, like you change between frame rates and resolutions. I find we do that a lot. So you may be shooting certain things at 4K, certain things at 1080p. I like to know on the camera what I'm shooting at. I'd like to be reassured that I'm in the right mode. Other box cameras like the Red Komodo, they have an LCD on the top of the camera. So if you have a look here, you can see you got this LCD here, and you can pull through all the information about the camera. You can change your ISO, change all the settings of the camera through that LCD, and you still have function buttons as well to go alongside that. That's a really good way to do a box camera. And something Panasonic could have done, like this camera has been known to the public for a really long time. They could have taken some of these design ideas and just implement it onto the BGH1. So if I get a top shot, they could have had an LCD on the top, but also had it so it flipped out. Like, I feel like that's the easiest way in the world to control that camera. Have a flip out LCD, you've got this little box camera, you've got your LCD on the side, you'd have your palm underneath, you'd be able to control the lens, you'd be able to have a little grip down here. Surely that would have been a much better design for this camera, to have a flip out LCD. They've got one on the GH5S, surely they could have just taken that exact unit and put it on here. I don't know, I just feel like they could have made something significantly better. Especially adding a flip screen. I think that would have been so cool. It would have been unlike any other box camera on the market. And yet they haven't done it. They've kind of left it with no screens, which makes it much less desirable as a cinema camera. I think something else they should have added is a variable ND filter. So, like you say, they're using it for drone work. Having a controllable electronic variable ND filter would have made this stand out above most other kind of options for FPV drones, for kind of cinematography style drones. It just feels really odd that they haven't implemented a variable ND kind of in the actual lens mount. We know it's possible on Micro Four Thirds because JVC did one probably about 3-4 years ago now on one of their Handycam cameras. I'll try and bring up footage of that. There's more than enough room in the Micro Four Thirds mount to mount a variable ND filter in there. Preferably an electronic one where you can dial the exact exposure into that ND filter. Ideal for drone use, which what they're kind of aiming this camera at. That'd been something really nice to see on this kind of cinema styled camera. Obviously you've got the SDI output. That's really good to see. Not many cameras in this price bracket actually have an SDI output. And obviously the high quality HDMI output and the Ethernet, they're all really good features. The power of Ethernet is also really cool. I like that a lot. I can imagine if we were doing like a shoot in the studio where we needed a camera over the top of, where we're doing top-down stuff, having power of Ethernet to that camera, remote control, I could see that being really useful. You control all the focus if you've got an autofocus lens. That's a really, really nice feature. So they've got some stuff that is really kind of well thought out, and there's that kind of technology is missing in this marketplace. I just wish they'd taken it a couple steps further, because it feels like they're doing a tiny bit of innovation instead of looking at this as like a completely new market for their cameras to go down, and they could completely innovate this whole box camera kind of sector and make something that's really unique. The other issues I have with this camera, and it feels like I have a lot of issues. Oh, I do like the heat management. I think that's really cool. Having an actual active heat management. And that's another reason why I feel they can fit that in there. Surely they can have some sort of raw recording. Heat's not going to be an issue. It just feels like Micro Four Thirds has a lot of advantages, especially when it comes to sensor size, just literally because of heat management. So you can cool the sensors much easier. You can get much higher frame rates out of that sensor. And it feels like Panasonic just don't want to utilize it, whether they feel like Micro Four Thirds is a bit of a kind of dead market and they don't want to push or innovate in that sector, which feels like an absolute shame, because if they really put their kind of minds to it, this camera could have been something that kind of ignites and re-energizes that market. The only other thing I want to talk about is this really weird placement of this top dial. You can see on the very first image they do with this, what is it, like XLR input module, quite a cool idea. Obviously you can kind of record and capture really high quality audio through the hot shoe, but it does block out this top dial. So the main dial used to interact with the menus on the camera, if you've got XLR inputs, if you've got anything on that hot shoe that kind of spills over to the sides just a tiny bit, you're really screwed when it comes to using that dial. So I think that's probably it, actually. I feel like I kind of ran over. That's enough talking about this camera. I hope this video is kind of useful or enjoyable. I feel like maybe doing these sort of videos is quite a good way to kind of talk about it and get it out there. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this. Hopefully I'm not the only one thinking that this camera is a massive misstep. Definitely comment. keep an eye on the channel as well. I think I may do a video about the GH6. I've written down some ideas about what I think that camera needs to be to kind of stand out, especially in 2020. And the BGH1 has definitely got me worrying that the GH6 is just going to be a very lackluster camera. And if it is a lackluster camera, I think that's going to have massive repercussions for Micro Four Thirds. Hopefully it isn't. But I'm going to put some of those ideas down into a video. I've done some kind of mock-ups of what I think it should be. They're not particularly good, but definitely keep an eye out for that. It'll be out in the next couple of days. Anyway, thanks for watching this video, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one.